Coming to you live from Colorado State University. Welcome to the AgNext podcast, episode 2. Today's guest, we have Dr. Sara Place with us, a feedlot systems specialist at AgNext here at Colorado State University. We're going to let her introduce herself a little bit and tell us about her career path and what she's been up to and what her research looks like here at CSU. To kick us off, would you like to tell us a little bit about yourself, Dr. Place?
Yeah, sure. Hello. My name is Sara, and I am originally from upstate New York. So I grew up on a dairy farm up there. A small dairy farm, like 70 cows, and kind of spent most of my life doing that in terms of being in a small community and taking care of animals for basically the first 20 years of my life. But went to a small kind of community college, ag tech school for an associate's degree in ag business, and then ended up going to Cornell for an animal science degree. And at the time, I was like really focused on like dairy farm business management. So I kind of took more business classes and was more, management focused. But I always had an interest in the environment and animal agriculture. And so I took a lot of like environmental classes at the same time. And then ended up going kind of serendipitously to UC Davis for a PhD in animal biology, but really focused on greenhouse gas emissions from dairy cattle. And that was working with Dr. Frank Lerner there at UC Davis, and kind of have jumped around in my career, and we'll probably get into that, but have bounced around. And now, even though I was started off on a dairy farm and my background is dairy, and that's really kind of where I always feel comfortable, I'm known as a beef person now, right? So it's kind of an interesting transition over time.
Yeah, you'll have to tell us about kind of the switch, where you felt like in your career that happened, where you kind of went from a more dairy professional to a more beef professional.
Yeah. So I think kind of my first real job, if you will, full-time job out of grad school was at Oklahoma State University. So I was an assistant professor in sustainable beef cattle systems there. And that was probably my first transition of going from, dairy to beef. And that's kind of what helped get me started in this whole beef area, right? So I helped with beef research when I was at UC Davis and started getting into and understanding the industry better. But that was really my first foray into beef, and then since then have been basically beef focused for most of my career. So
if we go back a little bit, and why you went to grad school, how did that happen? Like a business management and getting interesting environment, sustainability. And that's what drove you to grad school?
Yeah. So kind of the environmental interest for me has always been just because I grew up in a beautiful place, right? And so I've always been interested in those things, interested in a lot of different things, subjects, but that one is something that it's always been near and dear to my heart. But I was in a situation where, like, the last semester of undergrad, I didn't know what I was going to do, right? So I was contemplating going to California and being, like, a nutrient management planner, which is, like, somebody that helps with, like, a large dairy or large feedlot, understanding, what are their nutrient inputs, outputs, and compliance with regulations and things like that. So I was interested in getting out of New York State and going to the West. But then I went to a conference, the Northeast Dairy Producers Conference, and Frank Lerner spoke there at the conference and presented on the work he was doing with air quality in cattle and some issues regarding greenhouse gas emissions. And this was like 2008. Early 2008, and so at that same meeting, Henning Steinfeld, who worked at the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, spoke, and so he was the main author of a report called Livestock's Long Shadow. And so he was there, and then Frank was there, and just kind of providing context about like what is the actual footprint of animal agriculture, and specifically on greenhouse gas emissions. And so I found that fascinating because I am interested in and care about climate change kind of independent of animal agriculture, but then seeing that research and knowing that it was taking place, I was just super intrigued by it.
It's like an aha of like, oh wow, these things actually do go together.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
Yeah. And so I just kind of went up and introduced myself to Frank right after he spoke and was like, hey, I'm really interested in this, and what does it take to kind of study this topic? And ended up, I think, within like 10 days, had submitted my application to grad school and took the GRE, so not a lot of preparation in the GRE for that situation, but yeah.
But it worked out okay.
Yeah.
Were you involved in any research before, or that's?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So I was I was involved with a group that is, since it was in crop science and now it's moved into animal science at Cornell. It's called the Nutrient Management SPEAR program. Mm-hmm. And so they focus more on nutrient management issues. So I did a research internship with Cornell Cooperative Extension, and so more on testing soil for nitrate, nitrogen in corn and these type of things, right? Sulfur and supplementation of corn and all this other kind of stuff. So more on the crop side, but that was an integration of animal agriculture and crop agriculture. So I've always found that interesting too, the systems kind of perspective of how agriculture works.
Yeah, what a nice background. Like you think about you never close the doors for opportunities. You work in the business, management, crops, then you move to the dairy, now you work with beef. That's a very good take-home message that you don't have to set your path early on in your career. You have to be open for new opportunities.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think it's kind of a bit always ridiculous to assume like 18, 20-year-olds are going to know what they want to do, right? Yeah. Maybe your first step, but just more just going through, and never shutting the door, as you say, right?
Yeah.
Keeping the door open is really important.
Oh, that's very interesting one. So you mentioned earlier on that one of the things that's interesting you about sustainability, you grew up in that environment and things like that. And I asked this question the last podcast to Kim, and I want to ask you, what is your definition for sustainability? And if you can also tell more on not only on the background of your life, but what interests you in sustainability and animal agriculture in general?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so to start with, what is sustainability? I think it's a classic, right? There's the three main pillars of sustainability, right? So there's environmental stewardship, and that's everything from obviously greenhouse gas emissions, a lot of the work we do now. But for me, where I grew up, what's really important is water quality, right? So our farm is in the upper Chesapeake watershed, so the Chesapeake Bay that goes down to Baltimore, Maryland, and is really important for the ecosystem down there to not have excess nutrients, right? So things like that in environmental stewardship are a key part of sustainability. And then the social aspects of it, right? Social responsibility, the community aspects of sustainability, and that's near and dear to my heart because just seeing the importance of agriculture in communities in upstate New York and how it creates a thriving economy, right? Or in the absence of that, how it can really decimate an economy when that goes away. So that part of it. And then, of course, economics, which is super tied to all of those things, right? And thinking about how do people stay in business, right? Sustain their business in the long run. And that economic pillar is, in reality, none of them are more important than the others. But if the economic pillar doesn't work, nothing works, right? And so that part is incredibly important.
I agree.
Yeah.
So I think that Pedro's done a really good job of kind of laying the foundation for this next question. We know that you were previously with Elanco Animal Health as the Chief Sustainability Officer and also with NCBA. And you've also worked extensively in academia at Oklahoma State and here at CSU. We are curious what you find to be the main differences in those two areas between, the kind of the industry side and then more of the academic side in your kind of professional experience. What have you kind of seen, and are there any positives or anything that you've just noticed that are very different?
Yeah, so I think, all of those three phases are different, right? So from academia to basically a nonprofit, right, which is what NCBA is, National Cattlemen's Beef Association, and the Beef Checkoff is who I work for there, and then Elanco Animal Health. So they're all different in terms of what the motivators are, but the importance of science is clear throughout all three, right? And so I think it's just a different job role depending on where you are, right? In academia, both at Oklahoma State and here, such a big part of what we do is helping to train the next generation of scientists, right? And that's a very rewarding thing and a thing that takes a lot of your time when you're in academia. And I think it provides that leverage and that freedom, right, to be able to do work in different areas, right? Whereas when you're in a organization that is, say, the National Cattlemen's Beef Association, right, obviously I'm not going to do a lot of work on, say, sheep. Or
sure, styled
or
in,
something.
You're pretty focused.
Yeah, exactly. So that's one of those key things, and I think for for me, for both the National Cattlemen's Beef Association and Elanco, it was just interesting to learn about the industry from different sides of things, right? So for NCBA, I think what's fascinating is just to see the industry from that side of it, of the association, the history there in terms of over 100 years of that organization being in existence. And seeing the policy side of it, even though I wasn't really involved in it, just observing what happens on that side of it. So I think that part's fascinating. And then on the business side at Elanco Animal Health, I think it's just interesting as then, as you know, as a lot of folks that do get graduate degrees or do get science degrees, then go into those type of companies, it's then the reality of you can know about a bunch of processes and everything else, but you also have to build a business case for it. And why, you know, the why is this serving a customer? Why would this customer want to do business with you? And thinking about the marketing aspects of it too, right? So yeah, I think I find all those things fascinating, and from my background of I like business and I like that, and so it made sense for me to go into that for a while. So
is that something that your business classes background helped you to understand that? Is that something that were you facing when you went to industry and CBA? Were you facing challenges that you were not expecting while you were in school? How was that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think having that background definitely helped, right? And just having that interest in business, right? And thinking about it from a standpoint of, you know, coming up with a you know, spreadsheet model, like why does this make sense, right? Why are we going to do this? Who's going to pay? Why are they going to pay, right? And learning some things there as well in terms of from a business perspective of always thinking about that problem and how you solve it, and not getting so boxed into the technical, like, well, it has to be done in this order of steps. No, rather focus on the problem and then come up with creative ways of how could you address it in different ways, right? And especially in today's world, in this whole like ag tech space, right? There's so many companies trying to do that, coming into agriculture and seeing, you know, there's some things that we do that are very antiquated, right? There's still a lot of paper and everything else, and people looking at this like, why the heck are we doing this, right? So it's just fascinating to see that side of it as well, of focusing on problems and then understanding how do you build a business around something like that.
So kind of an interesting culmination of all of your kind of educational experiences. You've sort of dabbled in that throughout your career. And so I'm kind of curious to know, what was the kind of motivator to come to agnext? Why come back to academia after being away for a little while?
Yeah. And I think a lot of it is like every time I go to a new place in my career, it's just thinking about, I want to achieve this. And then once I achieve that in that role, if there's not another growth opportunity, I do kind of look for, okay, well, what's next, right? And I think for my time at Elanco Animal Health, it was, you know, very fascinating. Got to work with a great team, was able to develop this tool called UpLook, which helps create carbon footprints for both cattle feedlots and dairies, and was involved a bit in
and pretty well utilized across the industry.
Yeah. There's a fair number of cattle on feed now that are using that system, and then also, you know, being someone involved in the Elanco DSM deal to get Bovaer to the United States, right? And so, like, for me, that was like a big thing of
huge accomplishment. Yeah,
here's this technology that now hopefully we'll have access to in the U.S. But through that process of, you know, creating a model to look at carbon footprints of cattle systems, you also realize there's a lot of limitations there with our current models, right?
Okay.
They're fairly crude. There's a lot of things we still don't know, assumptions we're making. And that was a big part of it for me is, well, we can keep running against this wall of saying things are not advancing, or I can be a part of, how do I come back to academia and say, okay, let's push our knowledge bubble out a bit more and learn some more of these things. So it can create that positive feedback loop of we're learning more and understanding things, which is important, but then also doing it in a way that serves to actually move the needle in the real world.
Yeah, so that makes sense.
Someone who will be sitting in the position that you were, potentially be using the data that you are generating today.
Yeah, hopefully, right? Hopefully in all my former positions, right? Everything that we do here at agnext is incredibly relevant to those former positions, right? And I think that's the reality, is like in terms of pushing the limits of what we know and having that publicly available data and making sure it's in service of that greater good. That's really where
land grant mission.
The land grant mission is the best. Yeah.
And you mentioned a little bit early on about the mentorship and things like she being able to train people that's going to, I think that's good. I think we're going to talk about later talk about that.
Yeah.
But I think you mentioned one of the reasons that you being able to push the needle and work in research projects. Can you you've been here, we had an episode with Kim, and she mentioned that agnext is super new. You've been here for less than a year. Mm-hmm. Can you talk about the projects that you have been involved and things that you've been doing during this time?
Yeah. So, the other cool thing about why coming to agnext, and a big part of it is just the research infrastructure that's here, right? Mm-hmm. So, the Climate Start research facility that we have is pretty incredible in what we can do there, and that's where my research has mainly focused so far. And so that's that facility where we have the ability to measure individual feed intake, individual gas flux, and body weight gain on up to 300 animals right at a time, right? And so that facility is, to me, really exciting. That's where we've done some research of just looking at feed efficiency of animals and then relating that back to methane emissions of animals fed on a backgrounding diet. Some of those animals are now currently in our facility eating a finishing diet, and so we're really interested in how do those emissions change over time, right? As an animal that's a high emitter on a backgrounding diet, still a high emitter on a finishing diet or not.
And I'm going to have you explain that maybe one more time for folks, because I don't know that we've talked about how novel that research is, where we've had animals where we've measured, then they've gone out to on a range, or they've gone to graze, and then they're coming back. So if you want to tell a little bit more about kind of that piece of it, I'd be interested to know.
Yeah. So I think that's also, that part is unique. The ability to measure over 100 animals at once is incredibly unique, right? So like my background of being at UC Davis, a part of my PhD was building 2 what are called head boxes, right, to measure methane emissions on individual animals. And so I could measure 2 cows at once, right? And so like my experimental design was super truncated, where I had like 20 animals, and it was this huge pain of trying to shift everything and get 20 cows, and like, I feel really good about this data set, right? And we can get, a couple hundred animals, their emissions data relatively fast.
In more of a kind of a more natural environment for them.
Exactly.
That
so
way.
The animals are able to move around and just voluntarily visit all this precision equipment, right? And that's definitely important from a gas emission standpoint, because both the work I did at UC Davis and at Oklahoma State, looking at head box systems, the feed intake of the animals, when you put them in those systems, even though after you train them and everything else, it can drop by 8-10% per day. And that's really important for emissions, because the amount of feed the animal eats drives a lot of those emissions. So if we're not really capturing reality in terms of feed intake, how well are we doing of capturing reality of gas emissions, specifically methane, right? So
this facility here at CSU is ideal for a scientist like yourself.
Yes. So now we can measure lots of animals, individual animals, in a production environment that is more representative of reality of what we would see, right? So back to that idea of that circle of let's create knowledge that is relevant to the actual industry. This facility is super unique in its ability to do that. So, so to your original question, measuring animals on a backgrinding diet or a high forage diet, and then on a grain finish diet, one, it's to know, one animal's emissions changes over time, and just understanding dietary differences, which are fairly well established, but just reinforcing those relationships is important. But the ranking thing is important from a standpoint of genetics and, that idea of if animals are high emitters or low emitters, and do they remain high or low emitters is...
And you're talking about methane more
methane
specifically.
Specifically, yeah, good clarification. So methane emissions is important to say, can we select animals that are lower emitters, and they're lower emitters in a forage environment and a grain finishing environment. And so I think what will be helpful for us to know that, especially, is that we're also doing, of course, a lot of grazing research and measuring emissions on grass, and that's a lot more difficult research, challenging research. So if we learn that we can measure emissions on high forage diets in a confined setting, and it translates pretty well to the rest of their life cycle, I think we can have a lot of confidence that maybe we don't have to do as much of the labor-intensive grazing research, at least for the methane emissions piece. But what could we do, right, to accelerate the process when we're feeding them in confinement?
Sarah, a follow-up to JR's question, and I always tell people how nice it is to see Sarah presenting something. I actually met Sarah probably like 5 years ago, something. when she came to Greece, and I was fascinated taking pictures. And it's nice that today I still
Celebrity.
I still her slides. She was on my presentation.
That's awesome.
But and I remember you talking. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this. A lot of people who listen to us probably have an idea. But why methane? Why is that important? Why JR was asking that we are measuring methane. Why is that important?
Yeah. So methane, of course, is a greenhouse gas, right? So back to those different pillars of sustainability. Methane is relevant in a couple ways. In animal science, we've been measuring methane from cattle for basically 100 years. And the first reason why we do it is because it's important for the energy use in the animal. Right? So basically, methane is calories the animal's consumed and then is blowing off to the atmosphere. So understanding that energy loss is important to understand the basics of animal metabolism, basically. And reducing methane has potential benefits of improving the efficiency of animals in terms of how much feed does it take for them to consume to gain 1 pound of gain, right, for example. So that's the one thing with methane is it's important for animal nutrition and that piece. Methane is a greenhouse gas, though, and that's the other really important thing and why we're doing all this research now. Is that if we can reduce methane emissions, can we reduce the climate impact of cattle production, right? So methane is a gas that's more potent than CO2. Over a 100-year time frame, it's roughly 28 times more potent than carbon dioxide at trapping heat in the atmosphere. But what's unique about methane is it's short-lived, right? So it's a very potent gas, has a large radiative forcing effect, if you will, when it's first emitted. But it is short-lived. And so that short-lived piece is both a benefit and a challenge depending upon the emissions scenario that we find ourselves in, right? So it's always good to take a step back and say, at the global level, methane emissions have been increasing, not just from cattle, but across all economic.
I was going to ask, what are the additional sources of
methane? Methane is complex, right? We were talking about cattle, but it comes from cattle. It comes from all ruminants, right? So that's one of those caveats too, is wild ruminants. Giraffes, the world's largest ruminant. It's a giraffe.
It's true.
It's true. Termites, right? You can think of termites as like the insect ruminant of the world, right? Yeah. That's what they do.
Interesting.
Anyway, so termites, wetlands, basically any environment where you have like an oxygen-free environment and carbon material, rice paddies, wetlands, the inside the gut of ruminant animals, manure, landfills, anything like that will generate methane gas.
Got it.
So cattle are one of many sources when it comes to methane, and that's one of the things that makes it complicated. And so, if we take a step back, methane emissions have been increasing, and really what matters is the concentration of methane in the air. So if we grab an air sample right now, it's like at 1.8, 1.9 parts per million of methane, and that's been increasing, especially since the Industrial Revolution, right? So fossil fuels are another source of methane. So natural gas that we use is methane. And so any leaks of that or leaks of methane from coal mines, all that stuff is sources of methane, and it's all contributed to that increased concentration.
But your work focuses more specifically on the methane coming specifically from cattle systems and individual animals.
From individual animals from the front end of the animal.
Front end, okay.
That's
we're not doing the manure emissions per se. So and so, so exactly. So really when you zoom in, it's like, of course, cattle methane emissions matter, but they're one piece of the pie.
Of a bigger,
And cattle in the U.S., there's only 6% of the world's cattle in the United States, right? So we can do our part.
Okay.
But
we still have some responsibility to address these issues, which is why this exists, right? So we need to work with the team here to try to identify what are the opportunities for sustainable, interventions or sustainable solutions, to be able to try to drive down those numbers from the U.S. cattle herd.
Exactly. Yeah. So we're all, if everybody does their part, right, it adds up to make a difference. But of course, U.S. cattle are not necessarily like the driver of climate change per se.
That makes sense.
Do you see cattle as being part of the solution? I think that's a conversation that's been raising a lot in the past few years.
That's an interesting question.
Yeah.
And not on the opposite side.
Yeah. So I think that's back to that short-lived nature of methane, right? So the flip side of that if you can reduce methane emissions pretty quickly, the concentration in the atmosphere should respond more quickly than, say, CO2, which is more long-lived. Just meaning if we reduce emissions across the board very strongly, the concentration of methane in the atmosphere should come down more quickly.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason I keep focusing on the concentration in the atmosphere is that's actually what contributes to warming, right? It's the concentration in the atmosphere that has this radiant forcing or heat trapping potential, right? And so you can just think about it because there's a faster rate of turnover, right? It responds faster to what we do. And so that's to your question, Pedro, of like, can cattle be a part of the solution if we strongly reduce methane emissions, right, and do other things to try to make the climate contribution of cattle more neutral, right? Then yes, we can be a part of addressing these emissions. Yeah.
So what you're saying is that any reduction is positive.
Yeah. Any reduction.
Okay.
And methane reductions give you a bigger bang for your buck in the near term, if that makes sense.
Okay. Yep. Because it's a more potent
greenhouse gas. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. In the long run, you still, if we don't do anything about CO2 emissions, and it.
Yeah, well, you were talking earlier, it's a big puzzle and everything's connected, right? And so pull one string, what happens over here kind of thing.
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly.
Yep.
And the other point Sarah mentioned, it's every time that animal is producing methane, is losing
energy.
So if potentially decrease that, there's a potential to enhance performance. Right?
Yeah, exactly. So that's what we're seeking, right? Can we find those solutions that strongly mitigate methane, do it consistently, and also potentially improve the productivity of animal systems, right? That would be the win-win that we're seeking. Yeah.
That's great. So based on that, like what are the things that we talk a lot, we circling around the research, what are the things that you see agnext like accomplishing, Dr. Place accomplishing the next 5 years or 10 years?
Good question.
Where do you want to be in the next few years?
Yeah. So I think because of our facility, we have a few different opportunities in front of us that are very unique, right? And so we can kind of think about it as we will continue to do research on how the feed that we put into the animal affects rumen fermentation and affects animal performance and methane emissions, right? So that's everything from how do we formulate diets differently? Do we process feed ingredients differently, right? Things that we know already, right? For example, steam flaking grain reduces methane emissions, right? And so verifying those things and looking at interactions between those type of interventions and new interventions will be important for us. And included in that bucket of like what goes in the animal is like feed additives, right? Things like that, new feed additives, testing those out. And we are a place where we can do that research at scale and be objective, right? And so I think that's going to be a big part of our work going forward the next 5 years is that what goes in the animal, how does that affect the picture, right? And putting the economics and everything around that. The second thing is just what you could call the host genetics, the animals themselves. How does that influence the emissions? So meaning, again, back to that conversation of low or high methane emitting animals, is there a heritable component? Actually, we know there's a heritable component of that. So what can we do to advance the U.S. cattle industry because we have such a large facility?
Yep.
And I'm not a geneticist, but the one thing I know is like if we are going to do this type of work, we need to collect a lot of what are called phenotypes, right? We need to collect a lot of direct methane emission measurements from animals and combine that with their genetics, right? Their genotypes, right? And then we can build a big enough database that we can create a genetic selection tool for the cattle industry.
And for the genetics piece, are you working with folks here at Colorado State in Animal Science for that?
Yeah, so we are working with our geneticists here, so Dr. Merkens, Dr. Scott Spidell. We're also working, hopefully collaborating with geneticists across the country.
Cool.
Right? So
that's awesome.
Because this type of work definitely is national in scale and has potentially international implications, right, in the future. But so that part is really important. So basically, okay, what do we put in the animal? The genetic makeup of the animal itself, and then also understanding the rumen microbiome, right? Because at the end of the day, for people that are listening to this, they may think, why would you focus on the host genetics, right? All that matters is actually the rumen, right? Yeah. Which is true, right? The rumen is where this methane is actually getting produced. That's always important to know. Like cattle are not producing methane. The microbes within their rumen are producing methane.
Interesting distinction.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So they're just a mammal like us. They don't also
That's why
don't
you say
produce-
host, because they're hosting the microbes.
Yeah,
that
I
are,
know.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
Interesting.
Yes. Yes. But yeah. It's host. It's a friendly relationship.
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
Not a
welcoming.
parasitic
No,
one.
I'm kidding.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm joking.
And that is what's cool about ruminants, right? Is those microbes get a whole bunch of services. They get a comfy place to live. You know, the temperature is perfectly regulated for them. The pH is regulated. Everything's great. They do have to pass out of the rumen and sacrifice themselves for the animal to eat them eventually, basically, right? But otherwise, it's pretty good, right?
Yeah,
and
exactly.
And the animal gets a lot of it too. But those microbes are also what we want to focus on in terms of
driving down that methane emissions.
Yeah.
Driving down methane emissions. Excuse me.
Exactly. So driving down methane emissions, and there's another way to see that is increasing productivity in some of
Interesting. Yeah.
that's more on the animal side, right?
Yeah. So we're interested in total emissions that come from the industry, but we're also interested in emissions per unit of production, right? So emissions per unit of beef, for example, what we call emission intensity. And so that's always where, we could definitely do things that reduce methane emissions, but also negatively impact the productivity of animals, right? And that's not a solution, right? Because that's not helping from a food security standpoint, and the fact that we have increasing protein demand around the world, et cetera, right? So, that's always the balance there.
No, that's great.
Yeah.
So I feel like we've done a really good job of picking your brain in terms of your specialty and what you focus on. I'm kind of curious to hear from you about, so for agnext, you spend a lot of time on the road. So you go to a lot of conferences, you're on podcasts like this one, you're on radio shows, a number of things. What is what is one of the most common questions that you get from the audience in those environments?
Yeah. So I think it depends, right? Sometimes with sometimes more agricultural audiences, I still get questions about climate change and kind of the basics of that.
How that works,
Yeah, and people that maybe still have some skepticism there, and so those are fairly common questions. But yeah, I think there's different themes, and it depends on the audience, right? Sometimes folks are just like, well, isn't the solution that we should just eat less meat, right? Sometimes those are the questions, right? In audiences that are less agricultural focused, but more just thinking about it, well, that seems like a logical thing. Why do we do all this work, right? To try to reduce emissions from the system, right? So,
and what would be your answer to that question? Why? Why do we do all this work to reduce?
Yeah, I think the reality is, and based on all prior evidence, right, we're probably not going to have a major dietary shift across the world. So we're probably still going to have cattle. We're still going to have 1.5 billion cattle, or maybe less in the future. But how do we produce high quality nutrition for people and reduce emissions? And then that also opens up to sometimes those other conversations that happen as beyond greenhouse gas emission. Why did we domesticate ruminants in the first place? What role do they fill? And that's where, yes, these critters produce methane emissions, but they're also, right, using all these feed resources, these land bases that cannot be used for other things, providing all these other cultural services, ecosystem services. And so that
and even what you spoke about earlier with the economic piece in rural communities, right?
Absolutely.
So what happens in that scenario if all the cattle are automatically erased or whatever? What are the social implications of that, and then also the economic implications of that, right?
Yeah.
So it's again, with the pull the string, see what happens here kind of thing.
Yes, it's an interconnected web, right? And so I think that's always sometimes the non-agriculture audiences, one of the key messages I try to bring up for folks is that it's not either or, right? In terms of plant agriculture or animal agriculture, right, to that diet question, right? Most people on planet Earth are omnivores, and our food system is omnivorous. And if we think about natural ecosystems, they also are multiple trophic levels, meaning they have animals, they have plants, microbes, right, all working together. And so our agricultural systems kind of need that as well, right, in terms of those multiple levels and those interactions. And it's all about really recycling nutrients and energy through the system. So, yeah.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm assuming those are the questions that you wish people were asking. Like, what is the ideal question to ask in the presentation? How we can. I'm not sure if this is the right. I'm saying this again. How we can be, not solution, but how can we live together in this environment that everyone is contributing to
Yeah.
the sustainability in general,
Mhm.
I think.
Mhm.
But going to more like things that we are learning from you today, and there is a question that I like to ask is on your professional and personal career, whatever, what is something that you know today that you wish you knew 10 years ago when you were finishing school, for example?
Interesting. That's a good question. I think probably it would be helpful to know and have all the industry insights that I have now, right? And like I discussed before, of having all those different facets of knowing and understanding how decisions get made. Because I think that would help me be more successful right off the bat in terms of how do you communicate with people in a way that's relevant to them. I don't know what I was thinking to say. It sounds bad, to get them to do what you want them to do. But anyways, no, to actually make a difference, right? And to communicate effectively. I think that's the main thing that I've learned
Maybe
over
it's
time.
to get them to understand what you're trying to put out there, right? Maybe that's what it is.
Yes. No, and I think that's the main thing. I think it's learning by doing in terms of communication across multiple interactions of people that have agriculture backgrounds, no agriculture backgrounds. Because I think those are the things that you just gain through life experience in terms of having those conversations with people and learning and filing away each time something works or doesn't work. Of like, oh, okay, this makes sense. Just like basically human behavior. How do you actually communicate with people effectively?
Would you tell younger Sarah 10 years ago to focus a little bit, study human behavior or something?
I mean, maybe, or take even more communications classes, because I did do a nice organizational communications course when I was in undergrad, and I probably should have taken more communications, or maybe another one when I was in grad school or something. Kind of think through that.
If that's coming from you, who communicates really well, I think that's a pretty.
I mean,
good,
you're doing great on the podcast, so I think it worked out.
Thank you, I appreciate that.
that's a pretty good advice. So like taking more. I think
Yeah.
communication is a key piece, and we have a good communication team here, and that always
makes you look really good.
Yeah.
Even if you're not good at it.
No.
Oh gosh, wow.
But that's a pretty good advice.
Yeah.
Yeah. So do you like? Okay, so I'll keep on this. So I guess I'm asking the career questions.
Okay.
So on the same line, like you mentioned that there are a lot of things you learn while you were doing, and another way to learn things is when people give you some guidance, a mentorship. How important do you think were those mentorship in your career, and how would you advise a student or someone who is listening to us to seek for mentorship? I mean, our students are often looking for you. There is a pretty good mentor, but how important were those people in your career, and were you using like a good thing you mentioned? You went and you talked to Frank right after presentation, but was that intentional or just happened naturally?
Yeah, so I'm trying to think through that. That was a while ago, right? I think actually my brother was at the same conference. And I'm like, man, that stuff's interesting. Well, you should go talk to him, you know? So like one is even like in your family, right, of pushing you outside of your comfort zone. And I think that's the big thing for me is like I'm a very introverted person. So I think it's always, yes, forcing yourself to have those conversations, to seek out those people that you admire. And they may not be in your disciplinary field, right? They may be outside of what you're focused on. Because I can think of, a lot of professors at, say, UC Davis that are kind of outside of my disciplinary field that I thought were excellent, right? Scientists, just excellent people, and just, having those conversations with them, learning from them, hearing from what they do, how they focus on things, and the same thing going throughout my career. You can learn from everybody, right? When you have those conversations and hearing about people's life and how they navigate things. I think that part's really important, and mainly the whole like pushing yourself to get outside of your comfort zone. Yeah.
And that inspires me to ask Pedro a question.
Okay.
So earlier you mentioned, yes, this happened to me last episode, so now it's going to happen to you. I'm curious to know, Pedro, you mentioned at the beginning of the podcast that you met Sarah like 5 years ago.
Yeah.
And you also mentioned that maybe you were like just kind of
pictures,
fanboying over there with pictures and all kinds of stuff. So, based on what Sarah has described in terms of mentorship, what's it like for you to be sitting across the table now with someone who you were admiring in your professional career and now as your colleague?
That's pretty cool. That's an interesting question. I was even I mean, I've joked this. This is probably public. Like when I was applying for this job, there was only one person that I didn't want to compete with.
I'm guessing it's this one.
And I think I've told this to our boss, and that was Sarah, because I knew like she's a person that I admire, the way that she communicates. It's pretty cool. I mean, I keep bothering her quite often, going to her office and asking her questions. So to me, it's pretty good. I mean, it's a pleasure, and I learn every day. Not only the good thing about Sarah, and I think one of the interesting things we are talking about career, she make hard things become natural. And I don't know
Tell me
how.
more about that.
I don't know how. I mean, things just her, like I'm this explosive person. Like I move a lot. I talk like even though sometimes I calm down, but she's so peaceful and she
calm,
talks
cool,
calm.
collected.
I don't know how she does that, but I really admire that characteristic that she has, and ability and how to handle problems. That's pretty cool. And to me, it's not. I mean, I feel like I'm a postdoc student and learning because I do. It's been pretty cool, and I learned not only on the cattle side, but a lot on this mentorship and how she guides students, she patient, and I think that's probably good. Like the good thing about it, we can complement a lot of things in our group. And that's pretty cool. I see her as an example and as a person to guide that's bringing knowledge from the industry, from all of her past career. And I've said this already, but if someone is listening to us and have the opportunity to go to one of Sarah's talks, don't miss that opportunity. I always learn when I go out there.
That's an amazing answer.
Okay. Thank you.
Wow. Okay.
Very flattered.
That's very nice.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
I wasn't expecting that.
No, you did great. Awesome job. So I guess, as we start to wrap up, any final questions from you?
No, I think
one of the personal questions, maybe.
I think like Sarah pretty much answered everything. I think, the questions I was pretty curious to know, like the difference between industry and academia, how she thinks, and I think she answered that pretty well. We can wrap up now.
Okay, great. We're gonna ask you one more, and then we'll kind of close out. So, you've traveled a lot, and so what's your favorite place to visit? I mean, you can do U.S. or you can do international, your choice. Favorite place that you've ever visited.
Wow. Yeah, that's hard.
And you've traveled a lot, so you take a minute if you need to.
Yeah.
And you can define favorite how you want.
Yeah. I think some of the more interesting places I've been is just I briefly went to kind of East Asia. I went to Hong Kong and went to Seoul. And I think that was interesting, just of like the enormity of the population that's there, and just thinking about, we talk about we need to feed more people and there are more consumers and everything else. And I think we can very often get stuck in our U.S.-centric bubble. I know I definitely can, right? Like I'm an American that lived within 50-mile radius of my birthplace, right, for the first 20 years of my life. So very U.S. focused. And so I think any of those opportunities where I've gotten outside of the U.S. to me are the most instructive, of just to observe and learn, and realize and be humbled, right, of how much there is out there in the world, how much you don't know, and just all those larger forces that are actually driving, everything from the global economy and has ripple effects down to things like cattle production in the U.S. and what we're doing here. So
very cool.
That's a great answer.
Yeah, Sarah, because of like what do you do for fun outside of the work? Like we've been talking about the work, and you mentioned about the travel, but what do you do? What do you like to do outside of work?
Yeah. So I like being outside. So I enjoy biking when I can. I like biking or hiking. And then I'm a pretty terrible guitar player, but I like that too, and I like music.
Oh,
right?
I didn't know
that. Yeah. So I enjoy that stuff as well. So things that are not science related, like doing physical activity or doing something that's using another part of my brain, is usually what I like to do when I'm not.
What is your favorite band? Like what type of music do you
favorite
like to play?
band.
This is a deep question.
Or
I like rock music, so I'm more of like an alternative rock kind of person. But yeah, so in terms of playing music, I don't know, it kind of depends, right? Everything from like the Arctic Monkeys to
so cool.
Yeah, to little Chris Isaac. I don't know, just kind of a bunch of stuff. Yeah.
So next meeting that we do with our group, Sarah's.
It's
Serenade.
and when I say it's not good, I mean it's not good.
The Dr. Place Serenade.
No.
Diego also plays something. We can have a.
Okay.
We're going to have an
Yeah.
agnext band.
A
Yeah.
jam band
Jam
session.
band. It's
It's
gonna
going
be
to be
great.
the third episode.
Dang. All right. Well, thank you, Dr. Place, for joining us today. How can people follow you on social media or get a hold of you if they need to?
Yeah. We'll always email, which is questionable if I'll get back to you. I will admit. But on social media, I am on Twitter.
Okay.
At Dr. S Place. So yeah, I
Okay.
use that one
Really-
primarily.
Really good social media to follow. Like,
Yeah.
I've met a lot of people who know Sarah from her Twitter.
Me
and
too.
Yeah.
She posts a lot of good things.
Yeah, agreed.
There.
Yeah.
Awesome.
So don't
Well-
miss the opportunity to follow Dr. S Place.
That's right.
And if
That's
you're
right.
follow us, follow agnext. We've got social media on Facebook. We have Twitter as well as LinkedIn. So we would just love to have you follow in addition to if you want to follow Dr. Place too, that'd be great. But yeah, thanks for joining us. We're always excited to tell you about what's next from agnext.